and good afternoon. We've already introduced ourselves except for our esteemed guest, Dr. Thomas Hehir. I'd like to welcome you all, and we're very fortunate to have our former HDP student, Kerry Thomson, who is now a program associate at the Disability Rights Fund. Joining her as a discussant is Professor Thomas Hehir, the Silvana and Christopher Pascucci Professor of Practice in Learning Differences here at the Ed School. I'd like to tell you a little bit more about Kerry before we begin. Kerry brings more than 10 years of combined experiences in business, finance, and grants management in both academic and healthcare settings. She is an active advocate for the D/deaf community, capital D/deaf community, with an emphasis on making medical care more accessible for the deaf and hard of hearing. Kerry is also co-founder and spokeswoman for Text for Deaf, aiming to bridge the communication gap between the deaf and hearing communities. She recently returned from Europe as a 2014 Marshall Memorial Fellow, where she learned about 5 countries' economic, social, cultural, and political structures as it relates to inclusion. Professor Hehir served as director of the U.S. Department of Education's Office of Special Education Programs from 1993 to 1999. As director, he was responsible for federal leadership in implementing the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, and Professor Hehir was associate superintendent for the Chicago Public Schools and has served in a variety of positions in Boston Public Schools, including that of director of special education. An advocate for children with disabilities in the education system, he has written on special education in the reform movement, due process, and least restrictive environment issues. We'd like to thank both of our esteemed guests, Kerry Thomson and Professor Hehir, for taking time out of their schedules to participate in this event. And thank everybody for coming. So, Kerry, we'd like to have you begin, and we're all anxious to hear about all the interesting things that happened to you in your travels.
Thank you, Eileen. I always have very fond memories of Appian Way, and I remember when I first came here, I was struck by how diverse the student population is, and I knew that we all had different goals, but we had ultimately one goal in common, that we all had the goal of improving the world to make it a better place to learn and grow for all people. And I really felt that at the School of Education, and it's hard to believe that it's been 6 years since I graduated.
Oh, it is hard to believe.
Time really flies by. But thank you for that background, and I want to give a little more background in terms of what my disability is. And I thank you, Eileen, for not stating my disability, because I'm very much the type of person that believes that the person with the disability should explain about their own disability as opposed to owning their disability in a way, right? So what I have is called Usher syndrome, and it's a form of deaf blindness. So I'm profoundly deaf, and I've been so since birth. And when I was about 10 years old, they noticed that there was things off with my vision. I was always running into doors, tripping over things. I couldn't see anything at nighttime. So the doctor told my parents that I also have something called retinitis pigmentosa. So the combination of RP and deafness is called Usher syndrome, and that affects 45,000 Americans in the here. So it's a very small number, and sometimes it's very challenging to have the needs of a deafblind person addressed in general society, because we're so small that there aren't enough of us to come together, raising our voice, advocating for what we need, and advocating to be part of society. And in general, people who are deafblind tend to be living in the margin. Many of them have not gone on to college, do not have a job, and that's the unfortunate statistic that I'm hoping to change. And so I'm also from Louisiana, And there is a small population of people who have ushered in a part that's called Lafayette, Louisiana. So usually a girl who has ushers and a boy who has ushers, they have a very small chance of social interaction with the general society, but they often have community gatherings for people who have ushers. So boy and girl with ushers get together, they get married, have a kid, the kid has ushers, and so it's sort of inbreeding in a way because ushers is genetic. You pass it through, it's recessive, so both parents have to have the gene. And before me, there was nobody in my family who had ushers, and so I'm the first in the family. My younger brother, when my mom and dad found out about my deafness at 2 years old, my brother was born at the same time. My parents tested him, is he okay? Because the doctor said I had been born deaf, but they didn't know that until I was 2 years old, when they started to see that my speech wasn't developing where it should be for a child of 2. And so that's the background about the disability. In Louisiana, I want to sort of give a little bit of a backdrop to what my education journey was like in Louisiana. And when my mother and father were told that they have 2 children who are deaf, they didn't know where to begin. What does this mean for our future? What kind of education will we get? What kind of education will we have access to? And so the specialist told my parents that basically the best option is to send up to the school for the deaf. And that school for the deaf was 100 miles away. And that was no dice for my mom and dad. You know, why would you send children away to a school? Why can't they be educated here in our own community? So my mom and dad fought to make sure that I could get an education close by. But it was a trial and error process. There was no school for the deaf or classroom for the deaf in my community outside of New Orleans. So there was a pilot program for preschool, and myself and one other boy were the only 2 deaf children to be part of this pilot program. And from there, they put me in another school where there was a special education classroom. And I think special education has evolved a lot over the last 30 years, especially. And for me, about 25, I'm 35 now, so at the time special education meant something different then. It was really not about education. It was about putting a bunch of children who had different abilities in a room together, away from the general education classroom. I wasn't allowed to mix with the other children who didn't have disability. I had to go through a separate entrance of the school. For lunchtime, we always had to wait for all the other children to finish their lunch, and then it was our turn to have lunch when all those kids went back to class. That was what I initially came to know about special education. I had enough. By 6 years old, I'm done. I don't like this system anymore. And so I should have mentioned that I have an older sister, and she's hearing, and she's normal sighted. We've always called her the abnormal one in our family. So the 2 have to fully the maturity in this typically minority environment. But I wanted to go to the same school as my sister, and I didn't understand why I couldn't go to the same school as the other kids in the neighborhood. So my parents approached the school in our district and said, can she come to this school? So, well, we don't have sign language interpreters, and we don't really have any program or a combination to offer. So, well, we do have speech therapy, so it was really a trial period at that point. They said, we'll take her and we'll see how it goes. So I think after a couple of years, we started to feel settled in, and then around 3rd grade, the teacher said, she called my parents and she said, I want to talk to you. We thought, okay, the game's up. They're going to kick me out. And the teacher said, no, what actually I want to talk to you about is having Kerry put in a program for the gifted. And my parents always thought, well, we knew she was smart, but we thought that's because we're her parents. So they had to say that this is somebody who's really smart. She can be challenged, and she's not being challenged in this current environment. I want to put her in the gifted program. My parents were in support of that, but the principal was not. The principal believed that it would be a risk to put a child with a disability in the gifted program. The gifted program shouldn't be tainted with a child who had a disability. So we just kind of went forward as leave it alone and just continued to have me in the general classroom. We were still feeling pretty grateful that we were having that opportunity. So meanwhile, my brother, who has many times people tend to classify a disability, all people who have this disability are pretty much the same, when that's not true. Each person is an individual they may have the same type of disability, but they're still individuals with different needs, different backgrounds, different parent support, different community support. So for my brother, he had different needs, and so we had him in a different school. By then, there was starting to become more classrooms for the deaf. So there was a school nearby that allowed him to come in and be part of the classroom with several other students who were deaf. But in that school environment, he was bullied, he was beaten, the teacher didn't do anything about this. And my mother started to suspect that there was some abuse happening behind the scenes, and so she became a substitute teacher and a substitute interpreter to keep an eye on things, and she saw enough to say, okay, I'm pulling him out. My family is really not a well-to-do family. We always had food on the table, a roof over our head, and clothes on our back, but we were just getting by. We didn't have a lot of extra money, but we scraped and scraped to put together enough money to put him in private school. And the private school that we put him in, they said, we don't have interpreters. Again, we were hearing the same story, but for my brother, he needed a sign language interpreter. There was no, we'll make do with what we have. So the school said, we can't offer this. My mother said, what if we provide a sign language interpreter ourselves? The school said, sure, that's fine. So Monday morning, the first day of my brother's education in private school, my mother went up to the teacher and she said, I'm the interpreter. So he got a good education, I got a good education. Clearly I did get a good education if I ended up here at Harvard University. So that after, before Harvard though, I went to Louisiana State University, and I wanted to be a pre-med major. My goal was to become a pediatric cardiologist, and that the pre-med advisor at LSU said, you need to switch majors. You'll never get into medical school because of your deafness. That was very hard to hear. That's, again, what I felt. And this was around 1997. So ADA has already been out. IDEA has already been out. And I don't know if you remember where you were at the day that the American with Disabilities Act was signed, but I remember my mother made me stay home that day to watch it on television, and she said, pay attention. What's about to happen is going to change your life for the better. I didn't understand what was happening. All I knew was that on the television set, I saw people who were wheelchair users, and I saw people who were using sign language. To me, I was fascinated because I've never seen disability before on TV other than the woman who's deaf on Sesame Street. That was the only time. So, did ADA make a huge difference in my life? In some regards, yes. Did ADA change society overnight? No. I think 25 years later, we're still fighting the good fight for inclusion into society. And so going back to LSU, I just went through the motion, got my degree in psychology and English, but I didn't know what to do with the rest of my life. At the same time, when I was at LSU, I was an accounting assistant as part of a student work program, and I worked for 4 years in that job. My boss loved me. When I graduated, she had the opportunity to hire someone full-time. She said, I would like to hire you full-time, but I can't. I need someone to answer the phone. So after working 4 years, proving my capacity to do this kind of work, I was told because you can't hear. Again, I'm done. I'm tired of the discrimination that I'm faced in. If I want opportunities, I understand that I have to go where the opportunities are. I can't wait for opportunities to come fall in my lap. So I took a quarter and tossed it. Heads, New York City, tails, Boston, Boston and Rush. I have never been north of Shreveport, Louisiana. I have never seen snow. I told my mother, I found an apartment. I don't have a job, but I have several interviews lined up. I moved into Boston. She said, oh my God, dear, do you know it snows up there? I said, yes, but I've got to try. I'm more scared of staying here and having a life living on. I'm fighting for my future by staying here in the South, going the way things are going. So in Boston, I landed a job working for Brigham and Women's Hospital, and the finance and accounting skills that I had learned at LSU working there did come in handy working at Brigham and Women's Hospital, where I worked in research finance. But my time there, I saw how patients with disability were being treated differently from those without disability. It wasn't because of bad intention. It was because of a lack of awareness, it was lack of training, a lack of understanding how interpreters work in a medical environment. So, for example, a patient who's deaf may request a sign language interpreter, but a sign language interpreter cannot stay in the hospital room 24/7. So the interpreter is supposed to be scheduled when a doctor comes in and does round. When does the doctor do his round? So we could never, so often I was seeing that a doctor would come in and an interpreter is not there. The doctor would leave and come back when the interpreter comes back. And there was a delay in getting the care and information patients with disability needed. And that was a concern for me. And that was partly why I came up with Text for Deaf, which was supposed to be a way to bridge the gap between medical providers and people who are deaf. And I also wanted to do more with that, and I thought, I want to go back to school and get my master's, and that's how I ended up at Harvard. At Harvard, my goal was to think about also how to make education more dynamic and challenging. Remember that a long time ago, people told me that I was smart, but I wasn't being challenged. That have always stayed in the back of my mind. And when I was at LSU, I remember taking organic chemistry, and now sign language isn't as advanced as it should be. So organic chemistry, this is what the interpreter would sign in class. Something, something, something. Now that's just one word, because do you know how long some of these chemical compounds are? And she would sometimes throw the finger down, D-I-H-E-X, not sure. So you can't do the dash, I need to know the last three letters. Is it an A-S-C? Is it an Y-S-C? Is it O-L? Is it, I need to know. It makes them use different. If you don't finger spell the last three words, an explosion is going to happen because I'm using the wrong compound. So that was a problem for me, and it's the same issue that happens often, that many people who are deaf have a hard time going into the fields of mathematics, of science, and engineering, because sometimes sign language isn't advanced enough. There isn't a standard. Well, there's a standard being worked on, but there isn't a standard that you know all these terms in sign language. And so that's been a frustration of mine. And so here at Harvard, I was thinking about how to make education not just only accessible, but go beyond that. We shouldn't just have a low bar for students with disability. Raise the bar as high as possible. Many times they'll strive to go for that bar. And so I wanted to go back to, I haven't even got off the first page, okay? But
that's okay. Kerry knows I can at least finger spell. that's about it. Very slowly.
But they told me to sign there, and as long as you have to sign there. So, not only is education something that's really important to me, but thinking about employment, because as I was saying before, that many people who are blind do not have a job, do not get a good education, does not go beyond high school, if they even got to high school. So, I'm going to throw some data out there. The U.S. Department of Labor said that there's around 10% of people with disabilities who can work are unemployed. Doesn't sound that bad, does it? The average American who's unemployed is about 7%. But let me say that sentence one more time. 10% of people with disabilities who can work. What does that mean? What did the U.S. Department of Labor define as who can and cannot work? Well, they have defined me as someone who cannot work. So, in reality, also, the majority of the people who are working, who have disabilities, are working minimum wage jobs, are working part-time, are working jobs that do not offer benefits, or jobs that are meaningful. It's the bare minimum, but people are proud they have the job. That's important, but the workforce has to change to be more open to hiring a labor force that includes people with disabilities who are skilled. There are people out there with disabilities who are highly skilled professionals, and having broken through that barrier, you may have often applied for a job, especially when you're approaching your last year at Harvard, that you may have seen a job that an application that will say equal opportunity employer. Sometimes descriptions may say something random, such as must be able to answer the phone, must be able to lift 50 pounds. It almost became a boilerplate kind of job description, and you need to challenge that kind of boilerplate and say, why do I need to lift 50 pounds if I'm going to be a secretary? What do I need to lift that 50 pounds? Is there not anyone else in the office? So you need to adjust job description to think about providing reasonable accommodation to say what we thought we needed isn't really necessary. We're so used to saying it that we just keep saying it without thought. Second is enough. So when I was talking before about how I wanted to make education more dynamic and challenging, when I was in Tom Hehir's class, I remember an article that talked about the National Longitudinal Transition Study, and it said from that study that not the majority, but a significant number, I think 40% of students with disabilities felt that they were not being challenged. People are so focused, teachers and education are so focused on trying to mainstream or trying to include them in the general classroom, but go beyond that. When I was in Tom Hehir's class, I did a paper called All for All, and the all was supposed to be advanced level learning for all. I wanted to think about how can students with disabilities have access to foreign language classes, how to have access to math and science. And one part of the paper was I asked several schools for the deaf, what kind of curriculum do you offer your students? Do you have advanced placement? Do you have advanced mathematics? And what the response most of the time was, we don't have it in our curriculum, but we pair up with other local schools so that our students can go to the local schools and take classes there. I said, oh, well, that's good to know. How many of the students are doing that? Well, no one. That's what the response said. Do they even know about this option? The school said they wouldn't respond to that question. So many times students with disabilities are often not coddled, but protected. They're taught that not to do too much, that the fear of failure is very real. If you take on too much, you might fail at this. You can't compete and you cannot perform on the same level as another child in your classroom. So we're taught to keep our expectations low. And that needs to change. We need to think about, I don't want to say we need to reach for the stars and teach people with disabilities that they could become the next president of America or that they could become a deaf astronaut. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is they need to know that they could become an engineer, that they could become a lawyer. That's the kind of bar that I want to aim that bar for that. And so I remember one of the things I often heard about at Harvard was about universal design. And universal design, I love the theory behind it, that education doesn't necessarily have to be special education for students with disabilities. If you use a universal design concept, you're basically just saying everyone has access to it. We're reaching as many different abilities as possible. And universal design is also applied out in society. We don't think about curb cuts as only being a benefit for those who are wheelchair users. With curb cuts, there are so many people who use them. Elderly people, mother pushing baby strollers, delivery men. That's a universal design concept. In terms of technology, universal design has done a lot with technology. Even I have an iPhone, I have an iPad, and I have many things in front of me. And one thing that I love on my iPhone is an app that helps me communicate with people who maybe don't know sign language. So it's a general app that's called Big Words. When I'm talking to someone, maybe it's in the dark, maybe it's too difficult for me to lip read or see sign language. This app, I can customize it, so maybe it's a blue background, maybe it's a purple background, different font. It's free, and for most people who have an iPhone, most of us have a cell phone, and if it's not an iPhone, there are different kinds of apps that people can download to their phone, and that is a way to bridge the gap between the deaf and hearing world and for the people with disabilities and without disabilities. But technology is a great thing if you have it, if your country has it. So when I was here at Harvard, one of the classes I took was over at the Kennedy School. In the Kennedy School, the class was on United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child. And that class changed my life, really, because I learned so much about all these different human rights issues that impact children, the need for the right to a family, the right to a country, the right to a nationality, the protection from violence. All of these things were part of the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. But never once in the class did they mention children with disabilities. And the more I read all of the different articles and the different things that we were talking about in the class, that impacts children with disabilities even more than children without disabilities. And so I started thinking about disability rights as a human rights issue. It really is a human rights issue. The lack of access to healthcare, education, all of that is, I know you're apologizing, I didn't hear it, so I'm totally so sorry. So I was just thinking about human rights so much, and at the same time, in 2008, the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities came into force, and this was a new treaty that the first of its kind, and what it does is basically address that the CRPD for short is a human rights issue. Disability is a human rights issue. What makes it more special than American with Disabilities Act, which was the model for the CRPD and was used as a model for the drafting of the CRPD, the CRPD is much more empowering in its approach. It's not thinking about including people with disability, how to accommodate people into society. It's saying it's supposed to happen. And the CRPD believes that people with disabilities need to be front and center on disability issues that impact them. For my organization that I work with, Disability Rights Fund, we are the only grant maker in the world that help provide funds to what we call Disabled Person Organization, DPO for short. What that is, have you ever heard the term NGO? Non-government organization. DPO is the same thing as an NGO, but run by people with disability for people with disability. So it's not a charity organization. It's not an organization run by people without disability for people with disability. People with disability are on the board, are the ones that hold the full-time job, are the ones that are the directors or assistant directors. That's part of the empowering approach that we're trying to take. So many people believe disability is a medical issue that we need to be corrected innately instead of realizing that disability is actually a social construct. If everyone in this room knew sign language, my deafness would not be a disability in this room. But because almost no one in this room knows sign language, I have this disability in this room. Am I the problem? Not really. It's really my environment that's the problem for me. If you have Longfellow is being worked on now to become more accessible. So many wheelchair users, before they didn't have access, but now when you have the ramp, you change the environment completely for them to have access to this building. So you change the environment, the disability disappears. So I want to mention a specific article in the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disability, CRPD. So the CRPD has a very specific article for children with disabilities. It's called Article 23. And Article 23 is a specific article in the CRC. Article 7 is the specific article for children with disability. And bear with me, I'm going to read it because I think it's important. So, Article 7, state parties shall take all necessary measures to ensure the full enjoyment by children with disability of all human rights and fundamental freedom on an equal basis with other children. Section 2 says, in all action concerning children with disability, the best interest of the child should be a primary consideration. Section 3 is my favorite. Listen carefully. State parties shall ensure that children with disability have the right to express their views freely on all matters affecting them, their views being given due weight in accordance with their age and maturity on an equal basis with other children, and, this is the important part, to be provided with disability and age-appropriate assistance to realize that right. That's saying that the state government has an obligation to make sure that not only children with disabilities have a right to speak up to address matters that affect them, the state needs to also provide the accommodation. We can't simply say that our door is open to you. You have to figure out how to get through the door and tell us what you need to say. So, to me, that's very powerful. And that is partly the message of what the CRPD is about, saying that people with disabilities need to be front and center. So there is a disability rights movement happening around the world. And maybe I should give a little bit more explanation of what the UN conventions and treaties are. So what we call state parties, what we really mean is countries. So the United Nations has about 194 state parties. The U.S. is a state party. Mexico is a state party. So really, it's just, the state party just means country. When a country ratifies one of the UN conventions, what they're saying is that they obligate, it's not a law, it's a treaty, and they're saying that we commit ourselves to harmonizing our own country's legislation in accord to what the UN treaties are saying. So before, many countries in the developing countries don't have legal protection like American with Disabilities Act. There's nothing. So it's used when a country is saying we ratify the CRPD. we're going to change our legislation. Our legislation will say that children with disabilities have access to education and will provide the CRPD is all there, what you need to do. The state party just needs to follow suit. What's also important is that every 2 years after a country ratifies, they have to submit a report to the UN as part of the monitoring effect to say, this is what we've been doing. And the UN committee will say, this looks good, what else are you doing? We want to know more. So it's a way to hold each other accountable. And so I think I'm going to talk quickly about the Marshall Memorial Fellowship. I think you want to hear more. Stop talking about laws and legislation. We want to hear about Europe. Okay, Europe. So the Marshall Memorial Fellowship was supposed to be set up as a way for transatlantic dialogue between Europe and America. It was set up by Germany as a way to make penitence for their past mistake. And so for the fellows, there were 700 fellows who have to be nominated, and then from 15 to 30 are selected. So I'm one of 30 that was selected for the fall, and it's 15 Americans and 15 Europeans. The 15 Americans will go to Europe and go visit all these different countries in Europe. And the European fellows will come to America and visit many of the different cities. They went to LA, they went to Lincoln, Nebraska, they went to New York, Washington, D.C. It was about to see how the other side lives. What are their political values, their cultural values, but how do they differ in each of the different cities they visit? And so we first started off in Washington, D.C. In Washington, D.C., we had a lecture given to us by an American university professor, and he said, often people do not know their national identity until they leave their country. Or think about, many Africans don't know what it means to be African until they leave Africa. For myself, having gotten used to ADA and demanding my rights, I knew for me leaving the U.S. would be a big deal as a deafblind American. I cannot take my rights and laws with me across the ocean. I have to take whatever those countries have. And so in all of the countries that I went to, they had ratified the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disability, but even though there's laws and legislation and policies out there protecting the rights of people with disabilities, it doesn't necessarily mean that it takes effect. So I said before, we may be making strides in education for Americans with disability. We're not there with employment, and this is 25 years later. My fear is for many countries that don't have disability legislation and just started to have that in place now, they have a long way to go with getting their education up to standard for students with disabilities. But, so does that mean in 25 years they'll be where we are now? And does that mean in another 25 years they'll finally get ahead on employment? It feels like 50 years from now will finally be a good time to be a person with disabilities in Europe. So I think we need to figure out a way, maybe here at the School of Education, how can we address global, international education for all students with disabilities? How can we look at this issue beyond education? How does it affect all aspects of society? I told the other fellows, I'm not here to learn about disability. I don't want to meet with disability organizations. I want to meet with civil society. I want to meet with the different sectors to understand how is disability integrated in their work. I met with parliamentarians. I met with editors for prominent newspapers. I met with people working on refugee systems and working on migrant situation and working on gender violence and working on human rights, or city planning, how to do urban development. So if I met someone from urban development, I said, what are the accessibility guidelines in your country? What are the laws? Many of them said, we have a law. We have a law that protects the right of people with disability. Say, okay, what are the standards? Oh, we don't know. But shouldn't you know? You're kind of an architect, so if you don't know, how can we go forward? This law isn't helping if you don't know. And I wish I had more time to talk about all the different countries I went to, but I can give you a quick snapshot. In Belgium, I was thinking that this is the headquarters of so many international organizations. They just elected 4 deaf parliament members to the European Parliament. And I'm thinking, it's going to be an open-minded country. It was not. Brussels was a very inaccessible city. And everyone I met as part of the program was terrific. But walking outside with my cane or using sign language, you could see people were glaring at me in disapproval. I didn't belong in their society. They'd rather not see me at all. In Germany, a few weeks before I left for Germany, Berlin had just set up a memorial to dedicate in honor of the victims of the Holocaust, but specifically the victims who had disability. 70,000 people with disability were killed as part of Hitler's ordinance to make a pure society. Holocaust history doesn't often talk about this, but it is a part of the history. And so I was thinking in Germany, what would I find in Germany? Had they come a long way from the attitudes that happened 70 years ago? Germany was very focused on being a barrier-free environment. I would walk out there, and in Brussels, I saw no one with a disability. In Germany, I saw them everywhere. Equal member of society, citizens of their community. And nobody thought anything of it. There was no judgment, there was no look. They were just accepted. I felt the same thing in Spain. And then I went to Serbia. And I think it was powerful that the program coordinated so that you experienced 3 highly developed countries and then an Eastern European country. In Serbia, I was a bit fearful for myself having a disability there. Again, there was no one that I saw who had disability. I felt more here. I'm used to being a second-class citizen, being treated like a second-class citizen, but in Serbia, I was viewed as less than a human being for having a disability. And it's not because people are taught to be that way. It's because there's 577,000 Serbians who identify themselves as having a disability out of 7 million in the population. Where were they? Nowhere. Eastern Europe has a tendency to institutionalize and sort of imprison children and adults with disability. They're not part of society. They are put in the margins, in the fringe, and they're staying there. Even now, the BBC did a story last week about how children with disabilities now are still being caged. Haven't we come a long way? Why are we facing this issue now, in today's time? So I was thinking in Serbia, I was feeling very discouraged and feeling overwhelmed by how much work was still ahead of me. And when I was being driven around in the van with the other fellows in the back of the van, I was in front of the van just reflecting, and the driver leaned over to me and he said, "Do you know what they're talking about in the back of the van?" I said, "No." He said, "Do you know that the other fellows are talking about how inaccessible this city is?" These fellows who do not have experience with disability, who for some of them have never met a person with disability until they met me, suddenly I felt hope. I didn't start the conversation. I told them 3 weeks earlier that I'm thinking about disability and how it's integrated in society. So I may have a long way to go, but 14 of my fellows returned to their city this past week and told me, I joined a committee for ADA compliance, or I'm looking at how to make healthcare more accessible in my city. So sometimes it just takes one to have a trickle effect to reach society. We may have a lot of laws and legislation, but they're nothing without society. So we can talk to people who have no connection with disability. Sometimes people try to learn, they choose to learn in disability, but what I believe is the better approach is that disability just needs to be organically part of everyone's work, regardless of what kind of work that is. So I'll stop right here, because I know time is running out. I could say more, but I want to respect everyone's time.
Again, I don't have, other than I'm so impressed with what you've said here, Kerry. Some of the things that, being discussing here, some of the things that kind of hit me is, in thinking about these issues, the degree to which we can use social media in the future to establish norms of inclusion and disability rights. Presenting the counter narrative in a sense around where people, and this is true in the United States as well. I mean, we have a lot of work to do here as it relates to attitudes. There are thousands of kids who are still inappropriately segregated and who do not have access to high quality education, even here in the United States. But I do think I am increasingly impressed with the ways in which people are using social media to change cultural values. And do you have any thoughts about that?
Yes. I think, well, for me, I should say that I work with 30 different developing countries, and we may have a fancy website, we may have all of these press release and publication. What really our audience wants to use is Facebook. They want to use social media. It's more accessible to them in any other format. And we have been using social media to share resources with our stakeholders, our donors, with people who have disability, people globally and domestically, with anyone who's just curious. And we see that sometimes just posting these stories, people, when I post that story about the BBC and how children with disabilities were being caged, I post that on my organization, Facebook, and saw later that it got 14 shares. That 14 shares reached 800 people.
That's what I mean.
Social media is powerful.
And I think it is. I think it is. I agree with you that the laws, here in the United States, my perspective is that the laws have preceded cultural change. That I think the disability community has been very much focused on getting appropriate legal protection through Section 504, ADA, IDEA, long before there has been fundamental cultural change. And the issue, and this I think is relevant to the UN work, do you proceed with policy or do you proceed with culture? Julie, this discussion, Julie and I last week in my office, I do think where we can, we should proceed with policy. If you look at Section 504 particularly, as well as IDEA and the Americans with Disabilities Act, very savvy people from the disability community recognize policy windows to enact those pieces of legislation. In the case of IDEA, at a time when there were still hundreds of thousands of people with intellectual disabilities institutionalized in the United States, for instance. And so and we don't have hundreds of thousands of people with intellectual disabilities institutionalized anymore. We used to have 13 of those institutions here in Massachusetts, and there's just one left. And I think that's a public policy victory. But the issues you talked about in terms of your own experience in education, around the low expectations people almost automatically have for children with disabilities, are cultural issues. And as you know, I've written a book about students with disabilities here at Harvard, highlighting a number of, I won't mention any names, a number of students who I have had in class. And the primary reason I wrote that book is to try to get people away from this notion that you can't be, that many people have in schools, that disability and intellectual giftedness don't go together. That people are in the same exact experience that you have had. It's replicated throughout the country. You don't see kids with disabilities in AP classes in high schools or in advanced science and math classes. And there's absolutely no reason why that should be the case. So we still, but I do feel that as more and more people like yourself present yourselves and the accomplishments that you have been able to accumulate, even with the lack of cultural movement, hopefully that will change. Any thoughts about that?
I definitely agree that policy and legislation is important, that many wins have happened because of policy. I just like to have sort of a twin track approach. Policy and cultural change needs to happen side by side. We can't wait for policy to take effect for a couple of years and then try to bring up society to what the tradition should be from this point on. I think that I've had such goals and aspirations for an education for myself. There have been moments when I felt I'm so grateful for the education I got. I'm afraid to ask for more because it'll take away what I already have. But I still want to ask for more. However, when I visit other countries and see how much further they have to go, somebody in Serbia one time, she told me, she said, I told her on and on and on about policy, legislation, blah, blah, blah. And she said to me, you speak so articulate, and I'm amazed that you're able to vocalize your speech when you can't hear. And I said, you need to focus on what I just said, not how I said it.
Yeah.
But to me, it's an idea of how, what would my life have been like if I had been born in Serbia? An entirely different story. And I have to share a little trivia, not trivia, but a tidbit of information. Part of the fellowship required that each of the fellows bring a small gift to present to the speakers and presenters and people that we were meeting with as a token of our appreciation. And so I brought a box full of Harvard pens. Yeah. And my gift was always a Harvard pen. I went to Harvard, I went to Harvard, I went to Harvard, I went to Harvard. Change your
I have to go. I thought this was till 2. Oh, okay. I'm wondering if I messed up my schedule.
No, not at all. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I have students waiting for me.
Well, thank you very much, Kerry and Tom. We really appreciate this. We always wish we had more time. And of course, until the next time. I think that should be our mantra, until the next time. So, Kerry, I know your schedule is just packed, and we couldn't wait to hear about your trip and to see you back here again and to begin a dialogue, conversation with you, and bring you back into our community it's just been a wonderful event, wonderful sharing event, so we can't thank you enough. And you, Tom, we always appreciate
My
you.
job, I get paid to do this
Oh,
stuff.
no.
Well, it's true. Yeah, this is great. And my book's coming out in March.
Definitely.
And some people are in that book.
Okay, well, we're going to...
That Eileen knows for sure.
Yes, of course. Hopefully we'll be doing a webinar with you and about your book. And then, of course, our conference in April, on April 23rd, we're going to celebrate, or we'll come up with a great title, right, Julia?
Yes.
For our conference in April to commemorate, let us say, the 25 years of the ABA. So all of us here, I'm sure will be there, participating in some way.
I remember
Please,
that day.
Tom?
I remember that day.
Okay, so we have memories. Thank you so much, everyone. I don't know, Kerry, do you have time to stay a little bit longer? I don't know if people would want to
Sure.
ask you questions or anybody?
I'm open to speak with.
Good to see you.
Well, Eileen has my contact information. If you think of some questions later, email me there.
Okay, great. No, this is just, I'm just so pleased to see you here. And the year goes so fast when you're here as a master's student. It's just really, but it's so amazing and it's so profound an experience as you expressed. It was really wonderful to hear you talk about how transformative your classes were and how much more impetus it gave you to go out and just go after the things that you're so passionate about. And we really appreciate that. Really appreciate that.
It was my honor. It's my honor and privilege to be here.
Yeah, well, it's ours. It really is ours. So, well, we're just waiting. We'll wait till the next time, but we're just grateful that you were able to come today. Kind of. I know you had other things going on, but I'm so glad you came. So thank you all for coming. Okay.